kind of in planning of maybe being gone, maybe not. I just wasn't sure if I'd be back. I asked a friend of mine, Tim VanSchaick, to bring the message today. So as we wrap up our series on 1 Peter called Living Hope, Tim is going to share a little bit about his story and truth from the last part of chapter 5 of 1 Peter. Tim has a Bible degree from Biola University and has done some graduate work at Talbot School of Theology. He's married to Heather, and together they have 2 boys, an adult son, Drew, and a junior in high school, Ryan. So this morning, would you welcome to the stage in a Northeast way, Tim VanSchaick.
Is this on? Northeast way is nice. You guys are kind. It always hasn't been so, by the way. So when I decided to move out here to Colorado, my wife and I were applying for jobs at Caprock Academy, and I was sitting in the lobby waiting for my mock teach. They make you teach in front of them before they'll hire you. Getting into Caprock is kind of like getting into NASA. I'm proud that I did it. I don't know how I did it, but so I'm sitting in the office and guy walks in, cowboy boots, big hat, big belt buckle. And the lady, is getting me ready, and he looks over at me and says, "Hi, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Southern California, and I'm applying for a job here at Caprock, and I'm out here for my mock teach." And he just looked at me. He said, "Don't bring that mess out here." And that's all he said. So I have to ask your forgiveness. Can you forgive me? I'm sorry. I've tried to adapt as best I can. I actually like it here. We've been here for 9 years, so I don't know if I'm officially a Coloradan yet, but I'm working on it. So back in the day, like Seth said, I went to Biola University, which is a Christian college in Southern California. I was a Christian education major, and so one of the things we had to do is we had to be in an internship. Christian education is kind of this weird degree where it's some education and some ministry and doesn't fully prepare you for either, but I went for it. And so I had to be an intern at a church, and it turned out to be a pretty large church that I got hired at. And my wife and I both got hired as interns. So it's very exciting. That church was interesting because they had a lot more kids on Sunday than they did on Wednesday nights. And so, there were 100 kids on a Sunday morning. It's about 50 on a Sunday night or Wednesday night. So, I kind of went in with my eyes wide thinking, wow, this is a big adventure. And as we eased our way into it, the way it was structured was there was a head youth pastor, and then there were 2 interns in high school and 2 interns in middle school. Well, my wife and I were the high school interns. And as time went on, the youth pastor started kind of nudging me forward, saying, you probably ought to teach a little bit. And I thought, oh man, there's 100 kids out here. And so finally, I kind of nudged myself forward, and I started teaching. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like God was using me for something, using a gift that he had given me. And we began to see some fruit from that. The kids really, engaged with my teaching, and it was a lot of fun for me. And so as time went on, word kind of got out. And it kind of put me in some awkward positions because the kids would kind of grumble when the youth pastor spoke. And they were excited when I spoke, and he kind of knew that, and it was a little awkward, and kids would say stuff to me, and I'd be like, oh yeah, yeah. I tried. As time went on, there were some other things that happened. So first thing that happened was one of the elders came and said, we want you to do 80% of the teaching in high school. And I went, wow, that's a lot. That's Sunday, Wednesday, Sunday, Wednesday. Maybe I get a Sunday or Wednesday off here and there. That's a lot of teaching. So I stepped into it, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. Felt like we were seeing fruit. And eventually it kind of got awkward between the youth pastor and I, and things, were just awkward. And eventually an elder came forward and said, if you really want his job, I can make that happen. Well, at the time, my wife and I were making $300 each per month, probably spending 25 to 30 hours a month, or a week, working in youth ministry. So, we were making $3 an hour, which, believe it or not, back then was below minimum wage. And the youth pastor was making $30,000 a year. And so this was a moment of great temptation in my life, because I thought, man, there's a lot of financial stress right now. We've been working for $300 for 18 months. I love these kids. God's using me. This is fantastic. So I went home and I thought about it, and I didn't feel any peace about it. And the next day I came to work, and someone had put a book in my box. To this day, I don't know who it is, but it's called A Tale of Three Kings. And it's a study in the leadership styles of Saul and David and Jonathan. And I read it, and I knew I couldn't take that job. I knew. And I also knew that I had to go. And so with a lot of sadness, my wife and I began phasing out of the youth ministry. And it was very painful for us, because we had invested in these kids for, a year and a half, 2 years, and, we were newly married and had a house, and they would come over on Sunday nights and hang out at our house, and we just really loved those kids. And so walking away was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And but I did, and we awkwardly said goodbye, and a month or so went by, and a guy that went to that church said he was starting a new church a couple miles away. And his kids were in the youth group, and he said, I want you to be our youth pastor. And not only that, I'll pay you $800 a month. That's a big pay raise. And you'll start out part-time, and if things grow, we'll make you full-time. So it sounded like a fantastic situation. And so we prayed about it, and I went forward and started at this new church. And the thing is it's a small church. And we had maybe 10 kids in the youth group, and when there were 4 kids on the stage doing worship, there was only 6 kids it was pretty bad, right? And they can't sing. Some of them didn't sing, so it was just, it's kind of like a music concert, But I was out of my element. I'd never had to grow a youth group. I'd never been in that position. And I struggled. I wasn't sure how to approach that. I wasn't sure what I should be doing. And so over those first 3 or 4 months, things didn't really grow. A few new kids came, a few kids left. And so I was really struggling. And so it came about Christmas time, it was about 3 or 4 months into being there, that the pastor invited my wife and I over for a Christmas dinner. And we thought, oh, this is awesome. We'll have a little Christmas dinner. And so we ate and we had coffee, and they gave us a little Christmas ornament of a church to put on our tree. And it was really cute. And then he told me a story. And he told the story of these 2 people that were going around, and they went to the grocery store, and there was this awful smell. And they just couldn't figure out what it was, but it was terrible. And it was just a stench in their nostrils, and they thought, man, this place really stinks. They must have food rotting or something. And so they left the grocery store, and they went to the gas station, and there was the same smell. They went, man, this is awful. What's going on? Is this like a global thing? Is this a local thing? And so they went another place, and there's the same stench. And then he said, What the people didn't realize is they had Limburger cheese in their pocket. And that the whole time, the stench was them. And it took a minute for that to sink in, and oh, you mean we're the stench? My wife and I. Wow. And then he proceeded to tell me that he thought that I had a dearth in my soul. A dearth is a lacking, something missing. This guy had known me for 3 or 4 months. Probably spent 10 hours with him alone, maximum. He didn't really know me. But what a devastation for me, right? Here I am, a young man thinking my path is youth ministry. I'm still recovering from youth ministry. Ask anybody that's been in it, they're still recovering too. You can find them everywhere. The average lifespan of a youth pastor is 18 months, by the way. I don't know if that's changed since I was in youth ministry, but they wash out pretty quick. It's rough. But the suffering that created in me was huge. Because here I was on this life path thinking that God was going to use me in ministry and I was going to minister to kids, and my wife was on board and we were going to do this together, and it was so exciting. And then this comes. And a guy tells me, "You stink." Right? And I, to this day, don't know what he was referring to exactly. I don't think I stink. But I took that to heart, and it went deep, right? It struck at me, and it created some real suffering in me. And what I told myself was, well, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm too sinful to be in ministry. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe there's too many things wrong with me. I'm too broken for this. And maybe he's right that this isn't for me. And so I walked away from youth ministry and actually kind of went into a tailspin for a couple of years, because now what? Right? I wasn't prepared to do anything else. And I wasn't sure what was happening. And I told God, well, if you're going to put me back in ministry, you're going to have to drag me. He did, actually. I didn't learn my lesson. But I'll save that story for another day. We're in 1 Peter 5, 8 through 10. And the first verse is, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." How's that sit with you? Is that how you picture the devil? Roaring, prowling? There's an old movie with a quote in it that I love. I don't think I'll recommend the movie. It's pretty rough, but there's a scene where one of the devious characters in it says, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist." And I'll say this, you listen to missionaries that have traveled the world, people that come from other cultures, and spiritual warfare and spiritual conflict is a reality. It's out in the open, right? But I'll say this, here in America, this is the trick he's pulled. Because we don't know that he exists. Most of us don't even register that you have an enemy. And I know we know it in theory, but I wonder how deep that goes. So I'll make some assumptions based on biblical references. The first assumption I'll make is that Satan is real. You live in a day and an age where if you can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, or hear it, it isn't real. Right? Anybody ever tasted the devil? I hope not. Probably doesn't taste good. But the Bible assumes that he's a real person. Speaks as if he's a real person. Not just a force, not just a, entity. He's a real person that exists in space and time. Another assumption I'll make, based on Revelation 12, he has help. It's not just him. It says that when he fell, he took a third of the angels with him. He has help. He has a kingdom of which he is the head. We don't think that way very often. And I've grown up in very conservative Christian circles. We don't talk about that, right? The devil's just kind of out there, and we don't really know what he does, who he is, how he behaves. We don't think about the fact that he's got a kingdom and that he's probably really smart. John 10:10 says, I have one more assumption. Everything he does opposes God. And that means he hates you. That means he hates you. You, as a bearer of the image of God, are something he hates and seeks to destroy in any way he can. If that doesn't sober you, maybe it will. Right? We don't take this very seriously. And again, I'm not telling you to go start looking for Satan under every rock, right? And we know people that go there. Their house burns down and they say Satan did it, when really they just left the stove on, right? So I'm not encouraging that. But I also don't want to be the other extreme where we have our head in the sand and we don't realize there is someone out there opposing you. And he has a kingdom of which he's the head. And his job is to oppose everything good. And you are part of God's kingdom. And he is here to oppose you in any way he can. Does that make you worried? Does that make you sober, alert? I hope so. John 10:10 says, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I have come, and this is Jesus, that they may have life and have it to the full. Being sober and alert means that we're aware that we have an enemy that goes beyond the world and the flesh. And this is what I want to say. Christian tradition says we have three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil, right? My experience has been Christians are keenly aware of the world, right? We look around, we see what's happening, we see all the terrible things that are happening culturally, and it's easy for us to say, the world, right? It's terrible out there. There's awful stuff going on. So we tend to be keenly aware of the world because we want to separate ourselves from it. We don't want to appear to be of the world. And Christians are pretty aware of that usually. They seem to me to be less aware of the flesh, right? We tend to boil that down into just sexual temptation. And if that's not a thing for me, my flesh isn't going to bother me. It goes a lot deeper than that, right? The categories of sin run a lot deeper than that. I had a seminary professor that used to love to say that, and it's always stuck with me. Well, if it's not obvious to you what your sins are, most likely your categories of sin aren't deep enough. Wow. Let that one stick with you. If it isn't obvious to what your sin is, then maybe your categories of sin aren't deep enough. It's always stuck with me. But we tend to think, well, the flesh, I can manage that. I'm not sleeping around. I don't get drunk, right? But the third one is the devil. And we tend to reduce evil down to those first two things, typically. We see evil in the world, we see evil in the flesh, but we really are unaware of that third one, the devil. But it says that he prowls around, seeking who he might devour. We can also assume that the devil's really smart. And I don't know if you thought about this, but he's probably a lot smarter than you are. He's been around for thousands of years. He's observed sin, temptation, failure, all these things over and over and over. He's observed trends in civilizations. He knows these things, right? How smart would you be if you could do that for thousands of years, you'd be pretty smart, right? We don't think about him very much, but the truth is, he is very bright. And he has strategies, and he knows how to devour Christians and non-Christians. He knows what to do. I don't know that we give him his due a lot of the time, right? We just tend to think, he's out there somewhere. Why would he mess with me? I'm just an average guy. May be true, but I'll bet his kingdom is aware of you. He may not be directly aware of you, but I'll bet his kingdom is aware of you. And they too have been observing human nature for thousands of years. They're not dumb. If you haven't read the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, he kind of delves into this topic of a senior demon training a junior demon on how to tempt, how to harass, how to destroy a Christian. It's a worthy read. And it's not a long read, but so how does the devil roar and devour? Have you ever thought about what his tactics might be with you specifically? Does he just have a blanket temptation, like it's just a code he reads and blah, blah, blah? No. He knows who you are. Your sin, where you fail, what your weaknesses are, where your wounds are. We don't even know where those are sometimes, do we? We bury that stuff. And yet, we have an enemy that's keenly aware of these things, right? We so often ignore the fact that our wounds maybe were made on purpose. So maybe today, how does the devil particularly attack you? Might be something worthy to think about. Particularly if you see trends. So for me, going back to my story, that wasn't the last time someone said something to me that had no place to say something like that to me. I've been labeled and called things that boggle the mind. And for a long time, I just thought, well, I must just be a loser. And people see it. It's Limburger cheese. I think I took that to heart more than I thought I did, right? But maybe the enemy knew that that's where to attack. That I wasn't very secure, that I wasn't sure of how God gifted me, that I didn't have a lot of support. And that attack derailed me for years. It happens. So maybe you can look and see specifically, how have you been attacked? Because the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And God comes that you can have life and have it abundant. Let's look at an example. So here's an example. How do we get tempted? Matthew 4. Jesus is in the wilderness. You know the story. He's fasting for 40 days. It's a long time. I don't know what kind of shape I would be after fasting for 40 days. How about you? I think I'd be a train wreck. The enemy comes to tempt him. And you probably know the temptations. But here's something to note. The first two things he says to him. First temptation, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. If you are the Son of God. Is he the Son of God? Yes. Does he know that? Yes. And then the second time, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down and let the angels save you. Right? What is the enemy after here? His identity. His identity. And I want to say this morning that is often where the enemy strikes us. You probably hear voices, maybe not audibly, but when you sin, when you fail, you might have the enemy attacking your identity. I bet if we could show our hands, and I'm not going to tell you to show your hands, but I bet many of you have heard in your head, you know, a real man of God wouldn't do what you just did. If you were really a Christian, you wouldn't fill in the blank. It's specific to you, right? Specific to you. Whatever that temptation is, whatever that failure is, the enemy's right there to say, you know, if you were really a Christian, if you were really a woman of God, you wouldn't be doing that. And that's hard when the enemy comes. But I want to say today that identity is often where he goes after us. Often this is the very place he seeks to devour us. In our sins, in our failures, in our weakness, he often whispers, if. And how often do you agree? If you're like me, in those moments of weakness, there are times where I say, yeah, I did it again. Maybe I'm not a real man of God. Maybe I'm not the Christian I thought I was. Maybe that pastor was right about me. Jesus doesn't make agreements with the enemy when he's tempted in the wilderness, and neither should we. And so this morning, I want you to think about that. Do you agree with the enemy? Because the truth is, if you are a child of God, it's just like we sang this morning. The cross settled it. It's over. You're forgiven. And yet, how often do we get the message, you're blowing it. You're just not enough. You're just not good enough. And yet, God knew what you were going to do. He knew you would fail. He knows about your Limburger cheese, right? He does. And so the truth is, that's a lie. Your identity is a child of God. This was devastating to me, taking you back to my story. My identity had been questioned, and I made agreements. I made agreements with that pastor. And I learned that just because a pastor says something, it doesn't mean it's true. But you guys have Seth, so you know. Love you, Seth. And I had to go back to the truth of what God says about me and break agreements I had made with the enemy. Do you even think about that? When you're struggling, when you're suffering, do you make agreements with the enemy? Because that gives him a foothold in your life. You are agreeing with the enemy. So maybe today we can identify, where have I been agreeing? Where have I believed that I'm not good enough, that God's grace isn't big enough? That my identity is something other than a precious child of God. Because it's a battle. For many of us, it's a battle. And our failure and our sin just keeps coming up, coming up. I blew it again. Man, what a failure, right? Verse 9. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. Isn't it so often the case that we start thinking that our case is special? Well, you don't know how I've suffered. Right? You don't know who my husband is. He's a nightmare. Or whatever the case may be. You've never had migraine headaches. You've never had cancer. You've never had a divorce happen. We tend to think that our suffering is somehow special. And yet Peter's reminding us here, persecution of believers is happening everywhere. Does it look different in America than it does in Haiti? Yes. Does it look different in America than it might in South America? Yes. But persecution is universal, and suffering is universal. Try avoiding it. Won't last very long. Often our attempts to avoid suffering create more suffering. You ever had that experience? And suffering can be such subtle things. I often tell my students that I am the last generation that suffered through standing up to change the TV. What's suffering? But we live in a society where suffering is to be eliminated at all costs. Am I wrong? Cell phones, instant gratification all the time. We can't suffer through not being entertained anymore. If you listen to young people, that is their biggest gripe, that they're not entertained all the time. And someone that's older thinks, I had two choices, Tom and Jerry and Scooby-Doo. You've got Cartoon Network on 24/7 with thousands of shows and Tom and Jerry and Scooby-Doo, which I usually refer them back to. So we think our suffering is special, and that kind of gets us in the wrong headspace sometimes, because it is universal. Your suffering is unique to you. God knows your story. The enemy knows your story too. James 1:2 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This verse has always given me trouble. How about you? Because I know it's true, but I really don't want it to be. My kids like to say, "Can't we just be done?" Especially when they were younger. "Can't we just be done?" Sometimes I want to say that to God. "Can't we just be done? Can't we stop the growth and maturing thing? I'm okay." But we know deep in our hearts that maturity, growth, comes from suffering. Doesn't it? Think about normal life. We get taught this in all kinds of ways. If you're an athlete, or you've ever been an athlete, how do you become better at what you're good at? You suffer. Lifting weights is not fun. It's not. It hurts. It's painful. Running is getting more and more painful. Can only do it if I'm chasing a ball. But it's painful. But that's how we become better runners. That's how we become better basketball players. I tell students all the time, you want to be a great student? Read. Read something hard. Because guess what? You're becoming a better reader. Guess what makes school easier? Becoming a better reader. But is it fun all the time? No. So anything that's worth it in life will require some suffering. We live in a society that doesn't want to suffer. But we know deep in our hearts that anything worth having, learning a new thing, learning Spanish with Mrs. Thomas, there's going to be some suffering involved. When you have to learn new things, not because of Mrs. Thomas, she's wonderful. But it's not fun all the time. How about building a relationship? Is there some suffering there? Is there some worry? Some awkwardness? Possibility of getting hurt? That's not fun. But are relationships worth it? Yes. So the things in life that are worth it will require some suffering. And honestly, God has two choices. To leave you in the mess that you are. I'll speak of me. To leave me in the mess that I am. None of you are messes. Don't believe that. Or He's going to continue to try and grow and mature us, and the way He will do that is through suffering. There aren't shortcuts. We want shortcuts all the time. But suffering's the way. And it's the way Jesus showed us, isn't it? Think about it. It's the way Jesus showed us. So, what we tell ourselves about our suffering is really important. How often we come to blame our suffering on others and ultimately on God. And maybe that's where you are this morning. You know, God, I've suffered through this, I've suffered through that. Where are you? Why haven't you made it better? Or, it's my husband's fault. It's my wife's fault. It's my kid's fault. It's my head of school's fault. The list goes on, doesn't it? We always can find someone to blame for why we're suffering so bad. And it can be global. It can be as big as, well, America's terrible, and that's why we're all suffering. Or it could be very specific, right? We do this all the time. It's part of our nature to blame our suffering on others. And if you're like me, sometimes the suffering is clearly my fault. Anybody else been there? Yeah, I was kind of dumb when I was young. I still am, but I'm getting better. The thing is, maybe part of resisting and standing firm is trusting that our suffering has a real purpose. God's not up there and says, oh, oops, I didn't mean for that to happen. Look, he's got cancer. It doesn't happen. There aren't accidents. And so the question becomes, is this suffering for a reason? And if our answer is no, well, what does that mean? What does that mean internally? What does that mean emotionally, psychologically, spiritually? What does that turn God into? A monster. So, maybe your suffering is on purpose. And maybe there is a redemptive purpose. Does God really want an abundant life for you? Well, John 10:10 says he does. Are we there yet? No. But here's the thing. God's committed to the best possible you. He knew why he designed you. He is building something, and maybe we've resisted. Maybe we've been derailed, but he knew what he was doing when he made you. By the way, might the enemy have a clue of it too? Of your gifting, of how to defeat you. It is possible. But God knew. He knew. And he knew what you would suffer, and he knows what he's doing. And so, maybe your suffering has a purpose. And God's committed to the best possible you. You know, we often will just settle for whatever us we can get, but God's not going to let go. He's going to continue to make us into, he doesn't give up on us. He's going to keep fighting to make you what he made you to be. And that will require suffering. Verse 10, and the God of all grace who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. This is God's commitment to you in suffering. He's restoring you. Oh, it doesn't feel like that. I'm a basketball coach. It's actually how I know Seth. Seth coached with me for a couple years. Do I like making kids run? No. But do I know that they can't be a good basketball player if they can't run? Yes. And so the suffering is part of building a basketball player. Comes with the territory. Do we like it in the moment? No. But if I'm building the best possible basketball player, there's things we have to do to get there. And that's true with you too. There are things God has to do to make you into who he wants you to be, for the purpose that he has called you, whatever that is. And in a room this size, there's a wide range. So, he's restoring you. He's making you strong. Today I want you to think about some way in which you suffered in the past. Not right now. Some way in which you suffered in the past. So for me, I can look back at that cozy little dinner with my pastor friend. That was some suffering. For you, it might be something else. Might have been a health scare. Might have been a divorce. Might have been alcoholism. Might have been just a friend leaving you on the wayside. But you've all suffered. If we could hear the stories of everyone in here, we'd be crying. Because you've all suffered. You got something in mind? Now I want you to think about what came out of that suffering. What came out of that suffering? Did you see new growth? Did something change in you? Did God redeem that suffering? And for some of us, we're still in the midst of it. And maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I can look back and see that God has redeemed certain things in my life that were suffering at the time. That I'm a better man now than I was 30 years ago. And it's because I went through things and I suffered, and God has redeemed those things, and He has built into me and made me stronger. And that's what He's doing in you. Doesn't always feel like it. And again, the enemy's here to tell you, no, that's not what's going on. He's left you by the wayside. Your suffering is worthless, useless, pointless. So stop suffering. Right? That's what the enemy says to us. But God says, no. I'm building something here. I'm building something here. And He's committed to that. Now think about how you're suffering now. And here's what I want you to take away today. You're suffering. Everybody in the room has something. It might be migraine headaches. It might be a sore foot. It might be your wife's not nice to you. It might be your kids are rebelling. Just aging is suffering. It is. So there's a wide range of ways that we're all suffering. Some of it are of our own making, and some of it of others' making. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about how you're suffering now. And I want us to take that before God. And I want us to say, God, I trust you in this suffering. Can we put whatever that is in God's hands and say, I trust you that you are building me, that the suffering is not for no reason, that your suffering will bring about the things that Peter says. He's restoring us. He's making us strong, firm, and steadfast. He's done it before, and He's doing it now. And there are stories in Scripture where guys blow it, and God takes them back to the same spot and says, let's try it again. Abram's got that story. Peter's got that story. So He's doing the same thing in you. And if we don't get it, then He takes us back and He says, let's try it again. Can you trust that God, in your suffering, is making you into something that He designed you to be? Let's bring our suffering before God and ask Him to redeem it. Will you pray with me?